Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Vikas Shah. He is a successful entrepreneur and also a teacher of the MBA program at MIT and Manchester University, and also the author of Thought Economics, a fantastic resource of insights from just a veritable who's who of interviewees with incredible insights. Vikass, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I kind of listened to that and go, gosh, I want to meet this guy one day. So thank you for that.
Well, my pleasure. So you and I met a while back at a conference. You had shared a very personal story, which I'd like to get to. But before we do, I want to set the stage because there aren't many people that I meet who can say that they were a successful entrepreneur at the age of 14. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got there and what the story is to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main thing to realize is that entrepreneurship was never the aim. So, my dream growing up was to become an airline pilot. That was it. That was what I always wanted to do. And becoming an airline pilot is quite an expensive career choice. So my route to achieve that dream was to do freelance web design work and freelance design work for clients around Manchester originally. And the aim was very simple: to do that work to pay for flying lessons. And so it was kind of accidental, if you will, that design business then actually became the job, because that just grew all of a sudden on the back of market forces during the dot-com boom.
So fascinating. And for me, the sort of incremental step there for people to learn from somebody, like yourself is having the dream. Even if you can't achieve that dream, the steps that get you there provide you with, a pathway that is ultimately, in your case, I think, very successful. Do you fly now?
Recreationally as opposed to commercially. But sure. I think one of the most important things was it wasn't about having, let's say, this big, hairy, audacious goal day to day, because knowing that my dream, like at the time, knowing that my dream was, okay, I'm going to be a pilot at some point in the future. But then the naivety of being that age meant that you were raised to focus on the day-to-day tasks, i.e. pick up phone, make sales, build website, pick up phone, make sales, build websites, that kind of virtuous circle of design land. And I think it's one really important function in business is realizing that you've got to be very good at those day-to-day activities if you want your business to grow. And you've got to be constantly learning, improving, and refining those day-to-day activities that make your business work if you want your business to grow.
So as you step through that, so at the time that was web design, it was really at the sort of inflection point. I think, there's always an element of luck, although I hear repeatedly people say you make your own luck, but, right place, right time.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what you did and what that sort of led to.
Yeah, so the plan originally was literally to use the phone book, phone companies, build websites, and then every 2 websites I'd calculated would pay for a flying lesson. But the interesting part of it was, as the internet kind of suddenly came into emergence at this point in history, it was just, again, pure naivety, I think. I didn't realize how much business was out there. I didn't realize the value of these contracts. I didn't realize at the time, just from my age, that companies spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on marketing programs. And so when we were one of the first companies out there doing this, and all of a sudden we're getting global businesses ringing us saying, hey, we've got this project, will you take a look? And then when you see the budgets they had, it was a whole nother world. It was a whole nother world that I'd never even dreamt was possible. But again, I think because I was coming from a position of these numbers felt astronomically big, I kept the business extremely lean. And also, because I was coming at it from the perspective that I didn't know anything, I also made sure we hired in the best people to kind of go and run that. So I think the humility of knowing that you don't know everything, combined with always just making sure that your business is lean, sets those foundations up really well. And I kind of learnt that in retrospect, but it's been a lesson that I've taken with me since.
So I've got to ask, because I know the sort of timing of this. How were you teaching yourself? What was the sort of methodology? Because as you said, this was a new area. How did you get into that whole, designing, coding, and building of websites?
So when the internet first emerged, it was really basic, right? So learning to code and learning to build websites, genuinely wasn't dramatically hard. It was very, very much basic HTML, as you would see now, and at the most basic end of the HTML you would see now. I think the trick was applying the kind of visual arts to it. So I'd always been really interested in kind of painting and drawing and sketching and things like that. So it was kind of bringing that kind of love of arts into design and being able to apply design to HTML to make this thing, which was otherwise a boring bit of code, turn into something which had the visual aesthetic of what people were used to in advertising and design. And I guess that was the secret sauce. But one of the real tailwinds we had at the time was it wasn't hard to learn to code for the web then. It wasn't hard to learn to put design into the code for the web then, because now, today, learning to code for the web is a factor of complexity higher than it was then.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's another thread that I hear repeatedly on this sort of incremental steps. It's the combination of more than one thing or skill set, in your case, technology and coding, but importantly, adding in. And I think that's still true today. That part of my sense of this in terms of that constant reinvention and people's fear of my jobs disappearing with AI and so forth is, what am I going to do? And what I hear repeatedly about those steps is essentially represented by you, but from some time ago, which was, it's not just the coding, but it was the blending of the two that made you entirely unique.
Yeah, and also, I think there's an openness you have to constantly learning. Because by the time, even today, by the time you've learned a technology or a style of code or whatever, within a few months it may be redundant. So there's that constant need to learn, unlearn, relearn, and reapply, and also combine. So let's take the example of a brand everyone knows, something like Uber. Uber wasn't the first taxi app. It probably wasn't even the first 100 taxi apps in the world. But when Uber emerged, you suddenly had telephone technology, which was sufficiently advanced, connectivity, which was sufficiently cheap, and GPS technology, which was sufficiently good, that combined at that moment to make the technology possible. And on top of that, you had designers, not technologists, building the user interface to make sure people were able to use it. So Uber brought together a lot of ingredients in a very, very unique way, but none of the things they brought together in isolation was new. They were all very, very established things. And recombining things sometimes, in fact, often, is a very powerful way of building those successes, because also those incumbent technologies and technique have had the challenges, I guess, waxed out of them over the years whilst they've matured.
So you're now a young teen, tween, whatever, at this point. You've got these massive contracts, money flowing in, highly successful. What happens now?
So it was weird because there was no real plan. It was just kind of really good fun. And, I hate saying that because, everyone always assumes in entrepreneur land you should have a plan, but we didn't. It was just really, really good fun. And we just kind of followed the thread where the thread went. And, there was a point at which we had teams on the ground in New York, Manchester, London, and Sydney. We had our own online magazines and publishing portfolio. And I think the big thing which no one realized until it was too late was that it was a bubble. We didn't really conceive of bubbles in that sense, because bubbles previously had been, either the whole market or a specific commodity. It was never the case that a particular market segment could experience a bubble. So, the day that WorldCom went bust and then the internet bubble burst, that was a huge shock, because the industry didn't really have that language to understand that kind of economic phenomenon could exist. And so you weren't geared up to be resilient to it.
So obviously, huge impact on you. You'd created a large organization. Looking back, any thoughts about some of the experiences that, maybe you could have done better? I mean, And I wouldn't say predicting the future, because I think that's, ridiculous. But was there anything back there that you go, gosh, there was something,
Well,
or we could have done better?
I think there was a few things. I mean, I think one of the learnings would have been maybe we should have sold the business when we had the chance. During the time there was opportunities to sell for lots of money, and it would have been great. And hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I think the two other learnings would have been, first of all, to put resilience more at the heart of business, because especially when a business is scaling, you're really burning out all your assets. You're not in a position where the business is resilient to the choppy market. And making a business resilient might slow down its growth. In fact, it often will slow down its growth, but it gives you a more sustainable future. So I think that was one thing. And I think the second point, which is, I guess, a more personal point, is making sure that I, as an individual, had more resilience at that point. Because, when what you're doing is both your hobby and your job, it's difficult to not do it, right? So there was no hobbies, there was no friends, there was no family time. It was all just that. And that's not healthy.
Yeah, so and that sort of leads to your presentation, which as I said at the time, and continue, huge admiration for the willingness to speak out about this. I think you reached a pretty dark time in your life, and can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there was always a kind of background of stress and anxiety, and you kind of peg that to being, oh well, it's business, right? So you're going to be stressed and anxious. But I think the turning point was, well, I guess the support was when I was stressed and anxious and had this big business behind me. The business almost gave you a reason to continue. But then when the business wasn't there and the stress and anxiety still was, all of a sudden there was nothing to kind of keep me going. There was no kind of support mechanism around me in that sense. And then things took a really dark turn. All of a sudden this background anxiety got really severe, turned into a depression. That depression led to, started to feel suicidal. It led to, frankly, taking attempts on my own life on a number of occasions. And it's a really quick spiral. When that last bit of support, or the only bit of support you have, is pulled away, you can spiral extraordinarily quickly. And, resilience isn't in the language of education. It's not in the language of self-care. I mean, it's becoming so now a little bit, but so I wasn't really equipped with the tools to know what to do in that scenario.
So for those of you just joining, I'm just talking to Vikas Shah. He is a successful entrepreneur and teacher at MIT and Manchester University, and also the author of Thought Economics. We were just talking about, suicide and the depression, and the reality is we don't talk about it. It's like this, taboo subject, along with others. You have opened that door, I think, extraordinarily bravely, as an individual that has gone through that experience, and with an intent, ultimately. I mean, I think you even talked about one of the things that had, turned the page for you in one particular instance was just a phone number, I believe.
Yeah, and it was one of those things where it's difficult to sometimes realize that you're lonely until you have a conversation, right? So it was one of the times when I was in a particularly dark place, and it took a phone call to a support line at the last minute to talk me off a ledge. I mean, very literally talk me off a ledge. And it wasn't just making a phone call and speaking to another human being, but it was speaking to somebody honestly about how I was feeling at that moment in time. And that's the bit I think people need to do more of, because we've got this culture in any career, not just business, but any high performance career. We have this horrible kind of hyper alpha culture, which says I must never be weak, I must never sleep, I must never switch off, I must never talk about how I'm feeling. And that's really dangerous because it denies us of that factor of humanity.
So can I pull out what I think is one of the learning points? Because again, I'm passionately a supporter of finding a pathway and being able to talk about this. I think it's such an important area. I know from my profession, from clinicians, we have a huge challenge. We talk about burnout. And what I heard specifically there was the ability to just talk about those things openly with somebody is a sort of, it's a key step to reversing a potentially very negative outcome. Is that true?
It is, and I think it's because we don't know the consequences necessarily of that discussion. And I know it's an odd example, but it's kind of the movement around cancer did this really well, to the extent that the number of cancer diagnoses was extraordinarily low when people didn't have a language for it. They didn't have a sense of going to see their doctor with particular symptoms, because if a symptom occurred, the thought of what it may or may not be and the consequences of what it may or may not be was so severe, you wouldn't go and see your doctor, because it's kind of that defense mechanism. And I think with mental health, it's the same thing. If you have a suicidal thought, it's such a frightening thing. You're not really geared up to know what does that mean. And so in your mind, you're thinking, oh my God, I've had a suicidal thought. Thus it means I will kill myself. What you don't think is, oh, it happens. It goes away. It's just a thought. Everyone probably has them sometimes. And so we didn't really have a sense of context for mental health before. Whereas now, I think because there's more conversations being opened, people know that if that thought comes in, they may have heard somewhere on TV or on a podcast or whatever that, oh, it's okay if that thought comes, because it will pass and it doesn't mean anything will happen. In the same way that people know, if I find a lump, it probably is nothing, but I probably should go and get it checked out. I think it's a similar placing of that symptom, the thought of a lump, into a cultural context.
So, as a society and a caring world, how do we turn that conversation? How do we enable this? Because whilst you and I are talking about this, and I know we've got suicide hotlines, and those are promoted and available worldwide. Even, is that enough? Is the how do we turn this page? Because how do we do what cancer did? As an example, to use your analogy.
But I think it is a really valid analog for this, because we didn't cure cancer by having conversations about it. We've made progress because there's been public health campaigns to stop people smoking. There's been public health campaigns to encourage people to go and see a doctor. There's been all these things that happened, and it takes coordinated activity from policy, from grassroots organizations, from businesses, from all these things. In the same way that you can't smoke in a restaurant now. That's an important public health intervention. In the same way, there needs to be mental health positive interventions around communities and business that enable more mental health positive behaviors, or encourage things to happen which support mental health for those who are going through things. And this is my point. It's kind of, why isn't mental health first aid the law? Why isn't it the law around certain things like working hours or emails after work? Whatever it might be. These are the kind of things that help us make change, rather than just having conversations, as it were.
Right. So obviously things have turned around. You've got lots of other activities. I'm obviously incredibly intrigued as to how you've now moved past that. So moving on to the new business world. How did you turn that corner and start that whole process?
So I think the first step for me was, when I realized I really wasn't well, it was getting the help to just get back on an even keel. But then it was also then thinking, okay, well, I've only ever run my own business, so I was basically unemployable, right? So I had to think of, what do I do now? And I guess, again, the excitement of this whole new business model in technology made me kind of think, well, there's a lot of industries where maybe these business models could work really well. And that's when I kind of got involved in textiles, because textiles was a very old industry that was ripe for disruption and ripe for new business models. And also there was this sense of, I don't want to be just doing one thing anymore. It was a sense of making sure that I fill my life with enough diversity where it's intellectually stimulating, but also making sure that I'm doing something for the good of the community, because, it was a charity helpline that saved my life ultimately. And were it not for a charity, I may not be here. And that realization was a bit profound, because then I'm like, well, I hadn't necessarily been particularly charitable up to that point in my life, but somebody else somewhere had donated something to that organization to make it succeed and make it possible. And, where possible, I should do the same and, maybe make a better place in society.
Yeah, and again, a recurrent theme that I get across these interviews is that diversification. It's interesting. You mentioned something new to me, but intellectual diversification, I think, is important, but also from a life perspective that, you can't be reliant on this single channel or purpose, because I don't want to say inevitably, because, there's no certainty in anything, but, it's likely to fail. And if it fails, it brings everything down. And that diversity, I'm curious, do you still have, you still flying? Has that been a thread that's been positive? You still wanted to fly and that was part of it, or?
You know what, I did. And then, again, it's strange, because when you're a kid, naivety over trumps reality, right? So for example, so I live in Manchester. We've got a couple of very big, busy international airports near where we are, and once you get your flying license, there's a legal requirement to maintain a certain number of hours per year to keep your license. But when your home is right next to a big international airport, there's not that many places to go flying.
Right.
So the novelty wears off awfully quickly. And as much as I still love flying, it's I guess the position of where we are in England at the moment means that it's not necessarily as enjoyable to keep going, because you keep doing the same routes and over again.
Right.
So it's something that I'm still, it's just very much a hobby now. But I know that with something like that, if we move somewhere new where the skies are different and it's more open, I would love to do more of that, and maybe even look at getting a helicopter license or go gliding, things like that, because it's just beautiful being in the air. It's, especially when you're in control. It's a really
man after my own heart.
Yeah, it's a mindful experience. You can't do anything else. It's kind of like, you hear people who ride motorbikes talk of a similar experience where, if you're riding a motorbike, it's a very mindful thing to do, because you can't think of anything else, because there's a lot to do. You're busy. And flying a plane is kind of similar, where, you're not an autopilot. These are little light aircraft. But you're busy. There's a lot to do. You're constantly doing things when you're up there. And that in itself is quite a mindful experience, because you can't worry about life on the ground when you're flying.
I just want to thank you for finally explaining why it is I love riding a motorbike, knowing how incredibly dangerous and all those things. But that's exactly what it is. It's a complete decompression, because it's the focus. And it's very similar for me in sports or exercise, and really intense exercise, where it's one of the reasons I love squash when I played it, but it's not terribly prevalent over here, so it's gone by the by. But it was such an intense sport that I couldn't think about anything. It was that distraction. And the other piece is travel. That exposure to other experiences sort of opens up new possibilities.
Yeah, and this is the intellectual diversity piece, because there's a big wide world out there, and we're at a really privileged time in history where we're so utterly connected with each other, and the world is such a small place that if you have the capability to travel and you have the capability to expand your mind, what a waste if you don't do it. What a waste if all you know is your little world and your little job and your little community. What a waste of your own potential. And that's kind of why I spend so much time traveling and trying different things.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's a true privilege. I've had that privilege. I've grown up all over the world. I grew up overseas, was born overseas, and it opens the mind, and you capture that very succinctly. Unfortunately, as usual, we've run out of time. I can't tell you what a true delight and really a privilege, given the corridors that you clearly walk in, Vikass, that you've honored me and come on the show, and also specifically talking about suicide so openly. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining me.
Nick, thank you for having me on, and thanks for the great questions and for taking the time to put together such a great thread for our conversation. It's been a real pleasure, and really looking forward to having our next chat.
Thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that's brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, The Incrementalist, or share with me at DrNick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at HealthcareNOWradio.com. And tune in next time to hear my discussions with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm starting a revolution through evolution.